century vision and is moving us back to those 19th century conditions which Marx critiqued so avidly, and which in 1970 many people could plausibly say that has been behind us. That is something is part of capital's history, but it's no longer part of our present. So about 10 years ago, I found myself doing the following exercise. I cut a lot of newspaper clippings out of respectable newspapers like the New York Times and so on, Financial Times, about labor conditions around the world, in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, in China. And I had students read Marx's chapter on the working day, which is describing situation in Britain in the 1850s, and say, can you tell the difference? And the answer is no. Exactly the same sorts of things that were being described by Marx through the reports of the factory inspectors back in the 1850s can be found now in the reports from the International Labour Organization or organizations like Oxfam about labor conditions in Bangladesh or wherever. And every now and again, of course, there is an event like the collapse of the factories in Bangladesh, where we suddenly see exposed what is happening to labor. We read about the suicides of workers in Shenzhen and Foxconn, making our Apple computers and all the rest of it. We read about these things and we realize that actually this is the world that Marx's Capital describes. So this is why a book written in the 1970s, which actually at the time was not so applicable, is now far more applicable. And I think it's significant that it was not a very popular book when it was published in 1982. Everybody was impressed by the revolution that Reagan and Thatcher were going to bring. And everybody was tired of trade union power and all the rest of it. So it was not very popular at that time. When it was republished in 1999 by Verso Press, it sold many more copies than it did in 1980. And when it's republished again a few years back, sold even more copies. Because it provides a framework, and in exactly the same way that it helped me identify back in the 1970s how to think about the housing question. So it also today helps me think about the dynamics of what is happening in our cities and what kind of theoretical apparatus we should use to address the kinds of political economic problems which are emerging. It also helps to define something which, for me, is very significant. What we see right now around the world is a whole series of eruptions, if you want to call them that, of discontent. And they're often ephemeral. That is, they last a short time. They can be quite violent. They're nearly always totally unexpected. They seem to come from nowhere. But I guess I'm of a philosophical presupposition that says Nothing occurs by accident. There is something going on which connects the eruption that occurred in Taksim Square in Istanbul, what's been happening here in many Brazilian cities, what happened in London 2 years ago, what's happening in many Chinese cities, which are actually many reports of serious unrest, which are not easy to testify to. So there's something that is going on, and there's some deep discontent, deep well of discontent. And the question for me is, in what ways could we generalize on that discontent? Because when you look at the details, there's always a specific source of it. And each source is different. But what is it that connects, say, Taksim Square with here? What is it that connects here with Tahrir Square? Or Syntagma Square? Or Stockholm? Or London? What is the connection? And how do we conceptualize what that conception, how do we conceptualize that in such a way that we can actually say, look, we are all in this together. This is not just simply your issue, this is my issue. What is it? And it's at that point that I think the kind of arguments that come out of a reading of Limits to Capital and other books of this kind can maybe help. My sense of it, for what it's worth, if you want the simplest formulation, is that capital is doing very well right now, but the people are doing very badly. Now, that formulation, by the way, came to me, and I've forgotten exactly when it was, but I heard it first here in Brazil, and sometime back in the 70s or 80s, when I think the president said something like, look, the country is doing very well, but the people are doing very badly. And somebody can maybe tell me what the quote was, who was it? Because I heard it then, and I thought that's an interesting way to think about it. But that is precisely the situation now, except it's not the country doing well, it's capital doing very well. The rate of profit in corporations in the United States is higher than it's ever been, or at least it's higher than it has been since the 1920s. The level of inequality in the United States is greater than it's been since the 1920s. And the 1920s were, I would remind you, followed by the 1930s, which suggests that when you have that configuration in which capital is doing very well, but the people are doing very badly, then this is unstable even from the standpoint of capital. That capital has a great difficulty finding, for example, a market. If the poor are becoming poorer and poorer and poorer, who is going to buy the goods? And what kinds of goods are going to be produced? So this is, for me, a very simple formulation. And if that is the case, then it follows to me politically that what we should do, those people who are doing very badly, is to actually form an anti-capitalist movement. That is, instead of kind of saying, well, I'm struggling against this or that, you kind of say, look, I'm struggling over these specific things, but these specific things are embedded in this system we call capital. But it's very difficult to get people to think systemically. Nearly somewhere between 4 million and 6 million people in the United States lost their homes to foreclosures. They lost the use value of their homes because the exchange value system went crazy. And it went crazy in such a way that people made millions out of it. And it wasn't only the big bankers, it was the lawyers, the real estate agents, it was the mortgage originators, it was everybody. Made millions out of it. The exchange value system went crazy, and people lost the use value of their homes. When people went to people who'd lost their homes and said, you know, why do you think this happened? Who did they blame? They blamed themselves, which is exactly what neoliberals tell you you should do. In other words, we live in a world where neoliberal thinking has become deeply embedded. Individual responsibility, individual entrepreneurial venturing. If you do very badly, it's not the system's fault, it's your fault. There's even a whole theory out there called human capital theory, which, by the way, comes from Adam Smith. And the human capital theory says you have to invest in your own skills and your own training and all of that. And by investing in it, you then will get rewards. So it's very hard to explain why so many taxi drivers in New York have PhDs. But nevertheless, that is the argument. Now, human capital theory basically says people are responsible for forming their own capital, and then when they go into the market as laborers, they can use this capital and get a return on their investment in education. Oh, and by the way, you have to pay for your education. So we now in the United States have something like over $1 trillion of student debt. And you cannot get out of the debt by going bankrupt. The only way you can get out of the debt is die. So this human capital theory puts the onus upon the laborer. Marx laughs at this whole thing in Adam Smith about human capital and says, well, if the laborer really had capital, they would have the choice that the capitalist has. The capitalist always has the choice of taking their money and just investing it in a hedge fund and living in the Bahamas and swinging in a hammock all day and drinking margaritas at night. The capitalist always has that choice, whether to invest actively by making things or whether just to invest your money and live off it. The laborers can't do that. If I put money into my education, I can't capitalize it and go off and live in the Bahamas and swing in a hammock and drink margaritas and say, okay. I can't do that. So it's not really capital. And this is one of the problems with those people who like to talk about human capital or even cultural capital. But this idea then intellectually and also practically that we as individuals are responsible for the fact that we are poor. And if we are poor, it is our own fault. There's a huge educational thing here. how to say to people, look, it's not your fault. This is a systemic problem. This is how capital works. It works on the basis, particularly in its free market form, of the rich getting richer and the poor getting systematically poorer. And if you are poor, you are a product of that system. And the only way to rectify it is to change the system, which means you have to become anti-capitalist. So systematic analysis of this kind gives oversimplified arguments, and I'm oversimplifying a great deal here. But nevertheless, it's useful, I think, to frame things in this way. And you can frame a politics of anti-capitalism by looking at the way in which capital's contradictions relate to each other. For example, we have many aspects of our lives which were served to us as use values outside of the market. I was fortunate to be born in Britain shortly before a Labour government came to power. And as a result of that, I had free education right the way through to my doctorate degree. I think everybody should have that opportunity. Now in Britain, students cannot do that. They have to borrow. In the United States, they have to borrow immensely. Which society would you rather live in? One where education is a free use value available to everybody, or one where education is something that can be only gained through the market? Which society would you rather be in? One